Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual event. As many of you know, Third Way has been hosting a series of events over the past few months exploring the myriad crises facing our country and how these crises are upending our economy and politics. Before I introduce today's guests, I want to remind the audience that you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A function. I also want to take a moment to plug next week's event focused on priorities for the U.S. economy, featuring John Rogers of Ariel Investments and Charles Phillips, the former chairman of N4. Invitations for that should be in your inboxes shortly. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce my former boss and friend, the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, Eric H. Holder. He doesn't really need much of an introduction, but I will say that in addition to being an internationally recognized expert on the rule of law, criminal justice, voting rights, so many of the issues facing our country right now, General Holder is the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, where he's been focused on gerrymandering and redistricting reform. He's broken many barriers during his illustrious career, including being the first Black U.S. Attorney General. So I've been dying to talk to you about so many of the issues we're going to talk about today. But first, I just want to see, how are you doing? How is your family doing? How are you all adjusting to the new normal?
Well, it's good to see you, Akunna. Everything's okay. I've adapted to this notion of quarantine. I've got on a hoodie. That's kind of like my uniform now. For the audience to know, I actually have on long pants today, which is something that's relatively new. It's you get used to it after a while, and I wonder when we get back to normal, how many people are going to want to, actually go get in a car and drive to an office building. I've kind of gotten my little thing here now, and I'm pretty comfortable with it. So we're doing pretty good. We're doing pretty good.
Good. Yeah, I hear you on that. I think going back to commuting is going to be hard for a lot of people, but I also know a lot of people miss just being around the office. So it'll be interesting to see how we all adjust.
Yep.
I want to kick off the conversation though with race. We chatted briefly right around the George Floyd incident in the middle of the summer. And soon after that, the multiracial uprisings after those murders kind of kicked off. Do you think that we're at an inflection point? I mean, do you think that we're finally at a place where we can move beyond just talking about how important racial equity is and actually take concrete steps to change public policies? For example, take on fights around affirmative action and other meaningful things that can really move racial equity in the country.
Well, I'd say I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, I think we are at an inflection point, or potentially at an inflection point for our country. I think I've been heartened to see, that really broad coalition of people who've come forward, in the wake of George Floyd's killing, to demand justice. I saw a Pew study that I think that said that the majority of the people who were marching were not people of color, that they were white, and so that's that I think is something that's reassuring. I think we've seen Americans, of every color protesting whatever the proportions are, and that's a big change, I think, from even a few years ago, say 6 years ago when I went to Ferguson. And we had the Eric Garner killing in Staten Island at Ferguson, Michael Brown. And that got attention, but didn't really roil the nation in the way that this has. But I think what's critical is that we have a moment. There's no question about that. But the question is, will that moment turn into a movement, for change? We had a moment in 1965 when John Lewis got his skull cracked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And that was part of a movement, but it actually enhanced the movement and led to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So I wonder about that. I'm hopeful, as I say, cautiously optimistic. Justice isn't going to happen, overnight. A lot of the issues that we face in terms of race have been with us, since 1619. But I think that, maybe with the involvement of young people who don't carry a lot of the racial baggage that even people in my generation do, that maybe we'll get to, we'll finally get to that better place. But we got to keep pushing. There's no question about that.
Yeah. I mean, so when you think about the world that you entered into, you and, Dr. Malone entered into in terms of becoming young Black professionals, and you think about the world that your kids are going to be going into, do you think that it has changed more or less the same? Like what's gotten better, and what do you think are the challenges that, your kids and other folks, younger people are going to be facing as they kind of enter this world in terms of race?
Yeah, I think things are better now than they were 50 years ago and better than they were 50 years before that. I mean, you think about my father back in World War II, he's serving in the army, he's in uniform, he's in North Carolina, he's told to get to the back of a bus, he's in Oklahoma, and he's told to go around the side if he wants to get a hamburger. This is while in war and in uniform. And his son grows up, his boy grows up to be Attorney General of the United States. So, that's huge, huge progress. I think my kids are going to face issues that are perhaps more subtle than things that I had to confront. Race is still a prime determinant in this nation. That's still just a fact because we've never really dealt with, our racial past or the impact of that racial past in our contemporary society. And that's again why I hope we use this moment to have these painful, awkward but necessary conversations. I said back in a speech I got a lot of grief for back in 2009 in February, Black History Month speech at the Justice Department, that we were a nation of cowards when it came to talking about racial things. And I think we've gotten a little better since then. The events of this year have kind of forced us into those painful and awkward conversations, but it's not, I think, to the degree yet that we need to have done. And then you see things like from this administration where, they're trying to say if you do these training sessions around problems of implicit bias, which I think are really kind of critical. That's something that I think is really critical because we all carry this stuff around with us. And to say, well, if you do that, you run afoul of an executive order. So there's even now, pushback. There's kind of a defense of this status quo. So my kids, I think, will enter a more fair world, a world where they'll be judged more on, their abilities than the color of their skin. But they still need to be, taught defense mechanisms to recognize racism and sexism. I've got two daughters, and I think gender issues are something that are still, still with us. Race issues, sexual orientation. These are all things that are still a part of the American consciousness and part of what it is that we're going to have to fight. But I think things are better, and I actually think that we could get to that really good place, relatively soon with my kids' generations.
Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, you've been thinking about and your race and your work has intersected race with so many, for a long time, and certainly in the context of criminal justice reform. You've played a huge role in the way that we think about policing reform, and you did in the Obama administration. But one thing I want to ask you about is, how do we avoid the unintended consequences like what we saw with policies that came out in the 80s and 90s that led to mass incarceration? One of the critiques that we've heard from activists and others is that criminal justice policy is often shaped by educated and when Black folks have an input, is generally educated Black elites without much input from folks who are affected by the harsh punitive policies, and that maybe that's part of why we sometimes have these unintended consequences. Do you agree with that? And do you think that there are more diverse voices coming into the conversation around criminal justice and policing in Black communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to have a wide range of stakeholders who are involved in any kind of, policy changes. Obviously, the people who are going to be most affected should be a part of that conversation. But I think we got to get a grip on this also. You talk to people in the most distressed parts of this country, communities of color that are facing all kinds of socioeconomic issues, where there are educational deficits, where crime is a problem, and you tell them what we want to do is we're going to reduce in a dramatic way the police presence here. And those folks, not the elites, will tell you, well, wait a minute, hold on now. I want to be safe here, and there's a need for police. But what they will tell you is that we want to be treated fairly. We want to be respected when we interact with the police. We want the police to understand, what our neighborhood is about, and not stereotype us, not throw us up against a wall just because I happen to be a young Black guy with a hoodie on, somebody like me. And so there is that as well. And, so for, folks who are removed from that reality, you got to keep that in mind, this notion that public safety component in mind. Now, there's certainly no question that it can be done better. It has to be done better, more equitably. And there were excesses from what we saw, the policies of the 80s and 90s. But I don't think we want to let the pendulum swing too far, in the other way. I mean, the reforms that I tried to champion when I was Attorney General, I thought were, fact-based, evidence-based, would be supported by people in communities of color. And it's always trying to figure out, what's the right mix? How are we going to define law enforcement priorities? How are we going to define law enforcement initiatives? How are we going to build up trust between law enforcement and communities of color? It's not rocket science, but it's not easy either. And so trying to come up with what is that that right way is something that I think, as you say, needs to involve a variety of stakeholders. But I don't think we want to stereotype people in law enforcement in the same way we don't want to stereotype people in communities of color either.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, because there's a great essay in the New York Times. It was written by Dwayne Betts about Kamala Harris, who, of course, was a prosecutor before, and all of the conversation that was going on about whether or not she was progressive, having been a prosecutor, and really raising what this I don't even know if I would call it a debate, but this back and forth with Black communities want to be protected. They are also victims of crime and want to make sure that they are policed and that the prosecutors are, pursuing the criminals that are perpetuating crimes against them, and at the same time don't want to be victims of police brutality and over policing. And so, one of the points that is made in the essay is that we as a country haven't really reconciled this, and certainly in our communities, we haven't really reconciled this. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts, having also, come up in the system as a prosecutor and trying to reform the system, if you think that that is a path that those of us who care about criminal justice reform, like, how do we play a constructive role while acknowledging this tension?
Yeah, I mean, I think we ought to acknowledge that tension. But, it's cheeky of me to give, the person who's about to be the next vice president of the United States little advice. I think the mistake that Kamala might have made during the campaign is that she needed to own who she was, own her career and be proud of what it is that she did. I mean, she was a great reformer. She was tough on people who needed to be, you need to have somebody tough against. People need to understand something. There's a basic thing here. People write books and all this stuff, but you got to understand something. The vast majority of folks who live in the most distressed parts of our country are law-abiding, good people. They want to have the ability to send their kids to school and know that they're going to come back, intact. They want to be able to walk their streets at night. Now, again, it doesn't mean that you swoop down and you've got cops on every corner. And that you're arresting everybody for no good reason. Stop and frisk was an absolute abomination. But there is, it's not go from either stop and frisk to doing away with the police. There's a whole bunch in the middle that can be, I think can be the right path. And so that notion of attention is something that I think we ought to be sensitive to, but I'm not sure it exists to the degree that people think it does. Again, you can come up with ways in which you are meeting the needs of people in communities, whatever the community, whatever the socioeconomic condition of that community, and do so in a respectful, appropriate way. And if you do that, everybody is to the good.
Yeah. So earlier this summer, the House passed the Justice and Policing Act, and for clear reasons, it's not going to get to the Senate before the election. How do states and municipalities tackle police reform? So what are some of the key reforms that you would recommend that they prioritize absent federal action?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing people need to understand. And so, in terms of voting, you got to make sure that you vote down ballot, because if you're interested in criminal justice reform, that's going to happen at the state level. I mean, the federal government can certainly pass bills, and what the Democrats did in the House, I think, is important and should be hopefully passed by a Democratic Senate and signed by a Democratic president come next year. But on a day-to-day basis, how police and prosecutors interact with the community is really decided at the state level. And so I think things like making sure that police officers are trained appropriately in the use of force, given de-escalation techniques, coming up with ways in which we are testing for bias. You can be a really smart person and have great resume. That doesn't necessarily mean you ought to be a cop. We need to figure out exactly who you are, what your biases are, what your tendencies are. How do you react in strenuous situations? A greater degree of independence with regard to who makes the assessments about bringing cases against police officers who are involved in misconduct. Not necessarily leave that with the prosecutors who work with the police departments, all the time. In New York now, it's going to be the state AG who will make those kinds of determinations, opposed to the local DA. I think that kind of stuff makes sense. And then coming up with ways in which you try to foster dialogue between especially communities of color and people in law enforcement who are supposed to serve those communities. I think all of these things will go a long way to making for better, more fair law enforcement.
I want to shift a bit to redistricting reform, which is the area that you're spending a lot of your time and on which we work together. You've been working to try to undo the damage that Republicans did to the democratic process through gerrymandering starting in 2010. But gerrymandering is just one way that Republicans have been undermining our democracy here in the US, and as a result, democracies abroad. They've also gutted voting rights, which we see manifested in the long lines around the country to vote, denying DC and Puerto Rico's statehood. They've packed the courts. I mean, I think Mitch McConnell has done nothing else other than focus on courts and packing the courts over the last couple of years. And so thinking about all of these things, what would you prioritize in terms of democratic reforms over the next 2 to 4 years? Where does the next administration and Congress start?
We only get like 45 minutes or so. So I'd say, there are a couple of things that I think really good structural infrastructure things that I think would make sense. HR 1 that was passed by the House and deals with a whole variety of things that really would just kind of fix deficiencies that we have in the system. For instance, it would mandate for the creation of districts when it comes to federal office, these independent commissions that would be put in place to draw the lines, as opposed to state legislatures. I suspect if you did that for federal office, it would trickle down and you'd have it done for state offices as well. Take a lot of the ability of dark money in the system. Again, the bill would do that. HR 4, the John Lewis bill, which would in essence, recreate the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was gutted by the Shelby County decision in 2013 in one of the worst Supreme Court opinions of recent memory. But expand the scope. So it wouldn't just be covered jurisdictions, wouldn't just be the old Confederacy. It would really be something that would look at electoral practices nationwide, because we have problems now, not only in the South, but in places like Wisconsin, Ohio, the upper Midwest, in the Northeast as well. So I think those would be things. But then I think also, getting into something that you mentioned in your question. I mean, looking at our judicial system, federal judicial system. I think that, people say, well, packing the courts. Well, but that's kind of looking at asking the question without framing the issue. And you've got to understand what McConnell has done over the course of, since 2016 with Merrick Garland. He's in essence packed the court with people who wouldn't be there. Neil Gorsuch may be a good justice, I don't know, but he's in Merrick Garland's spot. And as a result of what happened there, what should have been a 5-4 liberal majority for 4 years did not exist. And among the questions that the court, I think, wrongly decided during that time period was the decision not to open up the federal courts to partisan gerrymandering claims. Merrick Garland's on the court. I suspect that's a 5-4 decision the other way. Now, a number of other cases during those 4 years. And so now trying to put another justice on, people say before election day. No. She's been put on, or trying to put on the court while the election is underway, something that's never, ever happened before. So I think, looking at the size of the Supreme Court, looking at the lower courts and making some kind of, needs-based determination, looking at the workloads at the courts of appeals, the district court level, and make a determination about whether additional judges need to be, added to those places. I think so. There are a whole variety of things. I think electoral infrastructure and then looking at our judiciary would be a good place to start.
Yeah. So would you support, for instance, adding 2 justices to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that to undo that which Mitch McConnell and the Republicans have done, and there's no principle involved in this. It's not about when you do it in the course of a president's term last year and all that. That's nonsense. That was just an exercise of raw power. That's all it was. You had the ability to stop Merrick Garland, got the ability to put, Barrett on the court. Well, if Democrats win the presidency, win the Senate, maintain the House, they will then have power. And that power, I think, has to be used in an appropriate way. Too often, I think progressives are uncomfortable with the acquisition and the use of power, and we got to get over that. You just got to get over that. It doesn't mean you're going to do things in the way that McConnell did. I think you got to be more responsible, more sensitive to the needs of the people as opposed to the special interests. But to use power for appropriate ways, I think that makes a great deal of sense. Johnson did it, transformed the nation in a whole bunch of ways. Roosevelt did it, and so there's a great progressive history about the use of power that I think we somehow become detached from, and we need to need to embrace it. So I think, expanding the size of the court, but then also using that power again to limit the terms of Supreme Court justices. Why should you be on the Supreme Court for 30, 40 years? They're going to be appointing kids coming out of nursery school on the Supreme Court, to just make sure that they can be on the court for 70 years. That's too much power for one person in an unelected position. So I think, this notion of 18-year terms and then having a president appoint a justice in his or her first year and third year of a presidential term, I think makes a great deal of sense. And we kind of depressurize some of the confirmation hearings. So I think it's time for us to maybe take a look at our systems and try to figure out, especially after the way in which norms have been just destroyed over the course of these last 4 years, what is it that we need to fix? What is it that we need to emphasize?
Yeah. Before we go to questions, want to talk about politics. So you talked about gerrymandering and how there are so many down ballot races that, that matter in terms of redistricting process next year. Are there any down ticket races that you're paying extra attention to for November, and any that are going to play an outsized role that our audience should be aware of for redistricting next year?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Texas State House of Representatives, there are 9, if the Democrats win 9 seats there, they can flip that House, and that would give Democrats a seat at the table when it comes to redistricting in 2021. The governor, the Republican Senate, and then you'd have the Democratic State House of Representatives. The Secretary of State's race in Oregon, Supreme Court races in Michigan and in Ohio, the legislative races in North Carolina, in Georgia, in Florida. So there's a whole range of places where my attention has been focused as head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, also that we can put people in places in these positions so that we'll have a fair process come 2021 in a way that we didn't have in 2011, where Princeton did a study and looked at what happened, what Republicans did in 2011, and said that it was the worst gerrymandering of the past half century. I'm not trying to gerrymander for Democrats. I just want to have a fair process in 2021, because I know that if the process is fair and if the lines are drawn fairly, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. We don't have to put our thumbs on the scale. We don't have to cheat. We'll do just fine.
Before we go, one last question. Before we go to Q&A, there's been a disturbing amount of action by the Trump administration undermining justice, and we chatted a little bit about this before we got on. All of these really actions that are meant to undermine the Justice Department through the executive and regulatory action. And so given the role you played in the Obama administration and through the transition, what priorities do you see for a potential Biden Department of Justice?
Well, I mean, I think the new Attorney General is going to have to set a tone, from day one in that first post swearing in speech about where the department is going to go. And I would say that the message has to be the department has to return to what it always has been and what it always, must be. And that what has happened over the course of these last 4 years has been an aberration. I mean, I started my career at the Justice Department. I served under Republican as well as Democratic attorneys general and did so proudly. I might have disagreed with the Republican AGs, but I never had any question about their good faith or their desire to keep the Justice Department independent in an appropriate way from the White House. Those norms have really been shattered by this Justice Department, and in particular by this current Attorney General, who sees himself more as the lawyer for the president than as the lawyer for the people. And so, that tone, and then putting in place people who will understand that, but then focusing on, criminal justice reform, antitrust matters, civil rights, putting the Justice Department back on the right side when it comes to protecting people's right to vote. Challenging laws put in place unnecessarily so by these gerrymandered state legislatures. When I was Attorney General, we were suing Texas about its photo ID law. Election occurs, Jeff Sessions is sworn in, and he takes the Justice Department from the plaintiff side and puts the Justice Department on the side of defending Texas. So, writing those kinds of what I would consider wrongs, I think, is something that the next Attorney General's got to be prepared to do, and be prepared to, be unpopular. The Republicans are going to come after you. They're going to, claim, oh, you're politicizing the department. All the things that they're not saying about Bill Barr, who's not only, politicized the Justice Department, he's weaponized it. And so you got to be prepared to take some heat. And I hope that the president will pick a man or a woman who's prepared to take the heat and to move the Justice Department back to where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, we've got a question from the audience. Mohsen Mirza, what should a potential Biden civil rights division prioritize? You touched a little bit about that. And how quickly do you think that the new administration can rebuild the civil rights division? Yeah,
I mean, I think it'll take some time, not a huge amount of time, because people have to understand that the career people at the department is 115,000 people in the department, something like that. I don't know, they're probably 40, 50, 60 political appointees. And the vast majority of the people in the department, they're liberals, they're conservatives, they're Republicans, they're Democrats. They really just want to get the job done. And if you give them, the right leadership, and if you also give them the freedom to simply do the right thing, the department will almost self-correct. Now, you don't want to wait that long. You want to hasten that process. So I think that's got to be a big priority. But the Civil Rights Division itself, I think, needs to focus, first and foremost on voting issues. That is the thing. Our democracy is really at risk for the way in which our elections are being conducted. We are, I think, too accepting of the notion of unnecessary photo ID laws that have a disproportionate impact on the ability of people of color, poor people, young people to get to the polls. We kind of accept that now. Gerrymandering, again, something we don't necessarily focus on. And with each of these things that is put in place and becomes more a part of who we are electorally, the people have less and less ability to change policy, to be real voices in the direction of the nation, and we become less democratic. And so I think protecting our democracy through the use of the civil rights laws, perhaps through the use of an enhanced Voting Rights Act, those are the kinds of things that I think the department should focus on. But there's a whole range of other things. The head of the Civil Rights Division has got to be, along with the Attorney General, somebody who's focused on criminal justice reform. I mean, we do have that moment that I spoke about, and it seems to me that you've got to have a Department of Justice that's going to be a part of making that moment something more sweeping, something more concrete. And so electoral things, criminal justice matters, I think that's probably enough to occupy an assistant attorney general at the Civil Rights Division for the first couple of months.
Sure. Another question from the audience: how do you talk and message around the fight to have fair redistricting with lines that make sense and protecting communities of color? Specifically thinking about places like Illinois' 4th, or yes, so just there with how do you speak about and message around redistricting with communities of color in mind?
Well, I mean, first I say that gerrymandering is just bad. If Republicans do it, it's bad. If Democrats do it, it's bad. I've stood up against Democrats who tried to use power that they've had in New Jersey, for instance, to try to do some gerrymandering, some things with the system. And I'm involved in this because I simply want the system to be fair. And so the lines, you some principles that we ought to have. The districts ought to be relatively compact. They should be respecters of natural boundaries. And there were districts there was a district in Virginia that was only contiguous when the James River was at high tide. It's like, really? I mean, come on, and we've also got to draw lines that keep communities of interest together, communities of color, other ways in which you define communities of interest. I mean, these things can all be done in ways that are fair. Doesn't mean you're going to pack people together or you're going to crack, communities of color or Democrats, Republicans. I mean, these are, you look at some of these gerrymandered districts, and it takes a great deal of creativity and artistic skill to draw these ridiculously gerrymandered districts. They look, nothing like any kind of geometric shape that we're familiar with. And if you just try to do things in a fair way, it's not that difficult. I mean, it really is not. And people don't have to think that there's a tension between the retention of power by communities of color and fair districting. There's no tension there. And so I would urge people who are concerned about that to put those concerns, by the side, because if the districts are drawn fairly and with those basic principles in mind, those 3-4 things that I just mentioned at the beginning, everything will be fine. Communities of color will be represented, quite well.
Great. Question from Siafa Haj. In the off chance that Republicans retain control of the executive, so Trump wins and Republicans keep the Senate, what should be Democrats' top priorities and strategic objectives?
Determining which country in Europe you want to go live in, or the Caribbean, Canada, perhaps as well. A situation where Trump wins and they keep control of the Senate. Okay, I have to wrap my mind around that one. If that were the case, the power, the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, becomes a critical figure in American democracy, and to the extent that there can be oversight, to the extent that the House of Representatives can block the negative things that would flow from a second-term Trump White House, and that's a really scary thought. That power that still resides in the House of Representatives would really have to be used, and I think in pretty aggressive ways. It would also require, I think, something of the American people. I can't envision a situation in which Trump is going to get more popular votes than Joe Biden. I think he's got a slim chance that he'll get more electoral votes, but I just can't imagine a situation where he'll get more popular votes, which means the majority of people in this country have decided they didn't want Donald Trump to get a second term. Those citizens, average citizens, have to understand the power that we have to understand the organizational capabilities that we have and what flows from organizing and being committed. And so, Democrats would have to do what they could do in the House of Representatives, and I think the people have to really exercise their power, understanding that a source of power is the federal government, but also there's power in the states and in the localities, and focusing your attention there. I think would be something important, but also understanding that these senators, these congressmen are sensitive to electoral consequences, and to the extent that you can raise your voice about a position, a vote that a Republican senator is going to have to take on healthcare, doing away with Obamacare, whatever, like Indivisible did, raise your profile as an individual citizen along with, with your fellow citizens, and that can have an impact. But as I said, I don't want to imagine that world. I really just don't want. I don't want to go there. And frankly, I don't think we're gonna be there.
Yeah, I'm with you. Next question from Casey Babbitt, and again to the audience, you can submit questions using the Q&A. What do you think is the best way to combat disinformation? So to what extent is it the responsibility of the private sector, so the social media platforms and the traditional media, versus the government to curb the spread of misinformation?
Yeah, I think there's a responsibility on the part of the private sector. The tech sector that runs these great platforms and that allows for widespread dissemination of good information, keeps us in touch with relatives and old high school and college classmates. I mean, that's all good, and there's a lot of good information that flows over the internet. But there's also a lot of disinformation, and so I think to the extent that they can use their algorithms and these unbelievably bright young people that they have there to kind of separate that stuff from that which flows to people, I think there is a responsibility to do it. And this is what I tell a lot of my clients. I think the reality is, if they don't do this voluntarily, there is going to be almost inevitably some kind of state-based, federally based mandate to make them do it, which is not going to be as sensitive to the way in which these companies want to conduct themselves. They will give up some degree of control if they don't get a little more aggressive about policing that which flows through their platforms. But I also think there's responsibility on the part that we have as citizens. We have, if the hairs on the back of your neck start to go up when you read something, if you see a tweet that's got like, from a person who's got like 14 followers or something like that, there's some common sense things here that we can employ to kind of ourselves, come up with ways in which we're making determinations about what's real and what's not. Now, there's some really sophisticated stuff out there that the Russians are doing, that domestic actors are doing, and that's more difficult to work your way through. But as Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify, and I'd say that is true in your reading as well. Read it, look at it. Oh, that's interesting. And then if it's something that seems just a little off, or that you're just really interested in, probe a little bit and read some other articles on the same subject to see whether or not what is being said is in fact true.
Yeah, we have got a cluster of questions about what happens if Trump cheats and steals the election, and whether or not the Biden campaign and Democrats in general are prepared to make sure that everyone's votes count. And we chatted a little bit about this before we came on, but your thoughts on whether Democrats are prepared, and what is our recourse if, for example, this Trump steals the election or goes to the Supreme Court, or any of these scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Biden campaign is prepared for what I call these like doomsday scenarios. I actually don't think we're going to get there, though. I mean, I really don't. But yeah, there are lawyers, all around the country. There's interactions, appropriate interactions with various groups who, litigate in this space. And the test ultimately will be, do our institutions hold? And there, I think the focus will be on the judiciaries at the state level and at the federal level as well. If you have, these kind of wild scenarios taking place, will the courts countenance these things, or will they do the right thing and apply the laws in such a way that the desires of the people are respected? So I think the campaign's prepared for it. I hope the courts are going to be prepared for it. And I hope that ultimately, if the Supreme Court gets involved, and again, I'm not sure that you're going to see this, but if the court is involved, I hope that people there will have the ability to look at things in a non-ideological way, a nonpartisan way, and really decide things in the best interest of the country and consistent with our traditions, our norms, and the laws that they would be, called upon to enforce. It would be an awful thing to have a president put back in place who lost, and I think it's going to be true pretty decisively, the popular vote, and then somehow ekes out a fraudulent victory by winning in a couple of battleground states. I mean, I think I think that the numbers just don't say that that's where we're going to be, but I think that's the kind of thing that even the textualists, the originalists on the court should keep in mind, because you don't want to put the country in that position, and you don't want to risk the legitimacy of the court itself. The court took some hits after Bush versus Gore. I think that the hits the court could take in a situation like the one we're talking about now wouldn't be fatal to the court, but would certainly hurt the court in the eyes of the American people for an extended period of time.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and we've got a cluster of them around the census. So first, is it possible to restart the census and still complete redistricting and reapportionment in the expected time? So that's from Tina Walls. And then another question about how we can counteract gerrymandering and the undercounting of communities of color, given all of what they're doing with the census and ending the counting time, from Jesse Price.
Yeah, it's hard to restart the census. You talk to the officials at the Census Bureau, and they've got to make their counts, their collection of information within a certain period of time. Because if you do it over too long a period of time, they say the information gathered at the beginning becomes stale. And if you're going to start it over, then you have to do the whole thing over. And I'm not sure that systemically we are capable of doing that. I mean, I wish that the courts had allowed the count to go to the end of October, as the Trump administration originally agreed to do, because everybody logically said, well, it's going to be hard to get out there and have the enumerators knock on doors in the middle of a pandemic, so let's give them more time. And then they realized, whoa, wait a minute, that means we'll have a fair count. No, we don't necessarily think we like that. So I think a little more time there would have been fine. Census Bureau officials say that, even with that shortened period of time that they've had, a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is, that, they can still do a pretty good count there. Now I worry about making sure that they have a sufficient amount of time to do the analysis of the data that they have collected, and not force it, sometime in December when they say they need till March or April, something along those lines. And if you give them until March, April, that won't interfere in any substantial way with the redistricting that will happen next year. So, but the census is critical. It really is critical. That is the foundation for a fair redistricting effort, in addition to, deciding where federal money goes. About $1 trillion in federal funds is distributed to the states for, infrastructure, for roads, for education, on the basis of the census. Private industry locates factories, plants on the basis of census data. So there's a whole range of things that are really dependent on having a fair and accurate census. And I worry, the count is pretty much done. I worry about the analysis part now. I hope that a sufficient amount of time will be allowed there, and that it is not artificially shortened, so that you allow a defeated President Trump to be the one who is the dispenser of the statistical information to the states. Let the Census Bureau pros make the call as to how much time they actually need.
We're just about out of time, but we've got a couple of last questions here about how to encourage folks who feel like their votes won't necessarily count, particularly in communities of color, or that their votes and voices don't matter. How do we encourage them to vote? And how can we ensure that they feel like they are part of the process?
Well, here's the deal. Your vote matters. Trust me on this one. If your vote didn't matter, do you think all this effort would be expended to try to keep you away from the polls, to try to make it more difficult for you to cast a vote? The folks on the other side understand better than we do the impact and the power of an individual going to a polling place, putting something in the mail, and casting a ballot. And here's the other deal. People died, committed themselves, sacrificed, gave their lives so that we would have the right to vote in a way that they did not. We dishonor that legacy by not going to the polls. Now, I understand, people are not satisfied with casting a ballot and for candidates who then don't bring about the change that you want. All right, well, then maybe you need to pick another candidate or get involved in the civic process yourself to try to push progress along. But if we want to have an impact on the way in which this country is conducting itself, the direction of the nation, you got to be involved in the vote. And all the naysayers, all the people who say it doesn't matter, that's nonsense. It really is. A galvanized and focused American people can change the direction of the country, force leaders to do things that they might not otherwise want to do. I mean, as a young man, I saw a war ended, not because we had reached all of our military objectives in Vietnam, but because there wasn't sufficient popular support for the war to continue. That was the people. That was the people making a determination there. Women got the right to vote 100 years or so ago. It wasn't because it was time. It was because people, women chiefly, led the way and forced that change on the nation. And the same thing with segregation. It didn't end because it was time. It ended because people got together, focused, and made a determination that the practice needed to be stopped. And that is still true in the 21st century. A galvanized, focused American people, individuals casting ballots, and individuals being involved in the civic life of this nation can really control the course of America. And so don't let anybody tell you that your vote doesn't count. Don't feel that your vote doesn't count. They wouldn't be spending millions of dollars trying to keep you away from the polls if your vote didn't count. It counts. Get out there, have a plan, and vote.
That's a perfect place for us to end. I just want to, again, thank you, Eric, for taking the time, General Holder, for taking the time to be with us today. And again, for the audience, thank you for your fantastic questions. And again, look out for an invitation to our next event next Wednesday on U.S. priorities for the economy. Thank you again. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Akunna. Take care.